right, everyone. So, we've been covering hypertext markup language, or HTML, for the last couple sessions, right? And as we talked about many times, what HTML does is it's a structuring language. Okay. So these are the files for today. DIGM 15.7 CSS basics. And I'm just going to take a look at this. And here I've structured some content. So this is like an H1, and this is an H2, and this is a paragraph. So I'm defining this to be a primary heading. I'm defining this to be a secondary heading. I'm defining this to be a paragraph, so on and so on. I'm defining this to be an unordered list. I'm defining these to be list items. These are hyperlinks. This is a footer. Okay. I'm just going to right click and I'm going to preview this in the browser so we can take a look at it. Okay. So this is what my page looks like by default. Okay. So, what HTML does is it says what it is, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't say what it looks like. So in other words, like what I mean by that, this defines this piece of text, my H1 defines this to be a primary heading, right? But it doesn't necessarily state, what size the text would be, or what the color of the text would be, or what the typeface of the text would be, okay? None of that is defined in the H1. So the question is, okay, I loaded this into a page. I'm using a sans serif here, probably Helvetica or Arial. So what is defining the visual look? Well, the default visual look of a web page is set by what's called the user agent. Okay, the user agent sets the default look excuse me, of a web page. Okay, so if I look inside here, I'm going to click on this H1 and it's kind of highlighted right now. In my elements, if you go over here, see how it says actually user agent? Okay, and it's actually defining some things about it. I'm not going to get too deep into it right now because we're going to learn it today, but this is saying it should be bold. This is saying the size of the text and all this sorts of stuff. So my user agent is defining the visual look, okay? What we want to be able to do is to change the visual look, okay? We want to sort of set it up so that we're not just using the out-of-the-box defaults of the visual look, that we want to set up our own visual look. So, way back when HTML was created back in the 80s, there actually were some HTML tags that would affect the visual look. There was tags like the font tag that would set the font, and there were some other tags that would do things like text formatting, like alignment and things like that. But there's a reason why we stopped using those. Okay, so to give you an example, here I have 3 pages. 1 page, 2 pages, and then 3 pages. Okay, these are all different cities, and we're gonna use these later. So the reason why we don't want to use HTML tags is when you write HTML tags to style a page, it's only specific to that web page. So for instance, like I'm going to preview this page here. This is a web page about San Francisco, and there's 2 other web pages, one about Chicago and one about New York City. Okay, right now it's a default of just a white background. Now we've learned that I could go in here and I could set a background color like this. So I'm going to set the background color to yellow. Okay. And if I go in here, this is now yellow. What's causing it is this piece of code. And this code is in the HTML page itself. Okay. The problem with that is, well, what if I have another HTML page like Chicago? This doesn't, affect, when I change this page, this does not update this page. So then I'd have to go and add it here. So now this should also have it. If I go to New York City, though, same problem, because I'd have to go into there, I'd have to add it again. Okay. So, you know, I've added a background color to 3 pages, right? And this could be, you know, in this case I'm using background color, but could also be something like using the font tag to define a font. The reason why this is bad is, what if I decided later on that I didn't like yellow as a background? Let's hypothetically say this is a project for a client. And the client goes, you know what, I don't want this to be yellow, let's do orange instead. So I go back to San Francisco, and I change this to be orange. So that one updates, but because the changes were made in the literal code, it's not going to get updated automatically in the other ones. So I'd have to go back, and I'd have to I'd have to manually go find the code, and I have to manually update it like this, and the same thing for this, so that they would all match. Okay. Now, in this case, I have 3 pages, right? So that's not a huge deal. But, like, imagine you're a really large website. Imagine you're like, I don't know, YouTube. YouTube literally has hundreds of thousands of web pages, okay? So every time they want to make a visual change, they don't want to have to go to every single web page and alter the code. That's just way too inefficient, okay? So the way that we've decided, the way this got solved was in the 90s, they started to realize that this was a problem. And so they came up with a language that was created specifically to handle the visual design. This is what's referred to as cascading style sheets. Okay. Cascading style sheets, also known as CSS, is a visual structuring language, or visual formatting language. So its job is, as I like to say, CSS makes things pretty. Okay, so CSS's job is to set things like background colors, typefaces, images, background images, spacing and things like that. Okay, so the idea is that rather than try to use HTML, which was never really meant to set visuals, we now have a specific language for it called CSS. And not only that, eventually what we can do is we can keep the CSS separate from the HTML so that if we want to, and we could use that CSS to apply to multiple pages, and if later on we decide we want to make changes to the visual look, like I want to switch a background color, I can update just one separate document as opposed to having to update every single HTML page. So right now that may not make a lot of sense, but trust me, by the end of this module, hopefully this is going to make a lot more sense about why this is a much better system. Okay. So as I said, CSS is a style formatting language. It has what we call presentation semantics. So in other words, we're going to set up the look and the feel of things like the typeface and the size and things like that. CSS, or cascading style sheets, typically when you see it, it'll be associated with HTML pages, but it doesn't have to just apply to HTML. So, you can use CSS in other areas besides just web development. You can use it in languages like XML, which is another type of structuring language. You can use them in SVGs, which is a vector file format. So you'll see CSS used in other areas besides just web development. Although typically they're sort of web development adjacent. The way I like to think of it is CSS kind of tinkers with the outside. Okay, so HTML structures things. It's setting up the base structure. CSS is kind of, the visual, it's kind of like painting the walls or putting on wallpaper. It's like the major structure is there. CSS kind of sets the outside look. And so here's kind of an analogy. It's like, here's this basic car, right? Just a basic car with a basic gray on it. Here's that same car with a completely different visual style, right? It's got all this cool little details and things like that. So they're both the same car. It's just that they look visually different, right? Like, it's not like the engine of the car is any different. It has the same number of wheels and, windows and all that kind of stuff. It's just, this looks dramatically different, right? So in the same way, it's like here on the left, this is actually HTML without any visual style being applied. This is an example of this HTML with some CSS or visual style being applied. So I can make the text white and make it a certain typeface and certain colors. But I can take that same content and I can use completely different visual style. I could use different colors and different typefaces and different sizes. And so both of these are actually the same content. They're just visually styled differently. In the same way that these are both the same car, it's just that this is visually styled differently. Okay, so there's kind of this sort of what I think of it as kind of like a conveyor belt. Okay, so this is how we build a website. We start with content. Content is things like, text, articles, images, videos, audio, whatever it is. You're going to make and record that content in other programs. So you'll use something like Photoshop or Photopea to make images. You'll write text in Microsoft Word or whatever you want to use, that sort of thing. Once you get your content, then you want to structure your content. That's the HTML part. That's what we've been doing over the last couple modules. So HTML takes the content and it labels what it is. So let's say I had an article. The articles, the article will be broken into like an article tag and an H2 and a paragraph and another paragraph. If it's an image, it becomes an IMG tag and things like that. We're now on the next step here, which is adding CSS. So in this process, nowhere in the HTML process have we really set a visual style. We haven't really set anything like what colors we want or what fonts we want or anything like that. So that's kind of the point of the CSS, is to set the visual style of things. Okay, CSS can only be applied on top of the HTML. You can't style something that isn't structured, so you can't. This is why this has to come first, and then you can add the CSS. In a more sophisticated website, and this is beyond the scope of this particular class, you would add in programming. Okay, programming allows you to add functionality. This would allow you to do things like you could program something so if someone clicks a button, a pop-up menu happens, or maybe a slideshow times out, so every 3 seconds an image will switch or something like that. PHP would be used for like a database. So for instance, you might have a form that people fill out, and then that information is sent to a database which gets organized for you, blah, blah, blah. Like I said, beyond the scope of this particular class, we're kind of going to end about here, but, in a more, you could take classes in computer science section that would cover some of these topics. In the end, all of your files are going to go into your root folder. So HTML, images, audio files, video files. We're going to create CSS files and learn about that. And then if you had any programming files like a JavaScript file or a PHP file, that would also be included. If you've ever taken page layout, like with Adobe InDesign, or you may have done this with Adobe Illustrator, there's something called a character and a paragraph style. And what the point of a character or a paragraph style is to sort of save settings. So for instance, it's like, in these programs like Adobe InDesign, which, if you've taken like a print layout class, either high school or at Chabot or wherever you may have done it, you may have created character styles. And what it does is, like, imagine I have a bunch of articles. I may have a certain style for certain aspects of the article. Like, for instance, maybe all of the titles follow a particular visual style. Like, they're all Times New Roman, and they're all 25 points, and, I don't know, they're all dark gray. Let's hypothetically say. And then we have body text, and body text is, it's 14 point size, and the space between it, the line height or the leading is 18 points, and it's Helvetica, and maybe it's a light gray. Okay, and so you could kind of create these, and there's kind of a point and click interface in Adobe InDesign, Adobe Illustrator, and to a certain extent some other text programs to do that. That's kind of like what cascading style sheets are. The difference here is that cascading style sheets, we are literally going to write the code for it. There's no sort of point and click interface like you would have in Adobe InDesign. It's literally, we're going to write code that does that for us. All right, so I've talked about the concept of syntax before. Syntax is the way of writing, or let's just say syntax is the rules of a written language. Okay. So all written languages have rules. I've talked about this before, but just to kind of reiterate, let's take English for instance, right? So a rule or syntax rule of English is, sentences start with a capital letter, right? And another one would be something like sentences end with a period. And another one might be something like, when listing multiple items, use commas, okay? These are what we call sort of grammatically correct. So it's like if you started it without it, a capital letter, that would be grammatically incorrect. You know what I mean? So you're sort of breaking the rules of the English language. HTML had syntax, rules like, HTML tags go in angle brackets like this, right? HTML attributes go inside of the HTML tag. When nesting an HTML tag, close it before closing parent, So in the same way, we're going to be learning cascading style sheets today. Cascading style sheets is its own language. It's separate than HTML. Even though they work together, they're not the same language. And so cascading style sheets, or CSS, has its own syntax. Okay. The syntax is going to look something like this. So the idea about CSS is that we're trying to select something and change it. So for instance, like, if I was in let's say I wanted to change the color of my text here. I could highlight it, right? And I could go up here. I'm just using text edit, but you could do this in any, graphic design program like Microsoft Word or whatever. And I'm just going to change the color to red, right? So what did I do? I selected the text, right? And then I made a change to it. So when we apply this to HTML, we need to select or tell the browser what it is that we want to change about the original. So if I have something like, here's my basic page here, this is exercise 1. If I want to make a change to it, I need to tell the browser what exactly it is I want to change, or what it is that I want to quote-unquote select. Okay, so we have what's called a selector. So you'll notice that the selectors look something like this. So for now, it's going to just be some sort of what it's going to be is some sort of tag name, like the P tag or the H1, something like that. Next is what we call a declaration block. So it goes inside these sort of curly brackets here, okay? And we have what's called a declaration. The declaration is the thing that we want to change about the selector. So what am I trying to change? Am I trying to change the text color? Am I trying to try to change the text alignment, or the fonts, or the font size, whatever it is? So that happens in the declaration. Declarations are made up of two parts, a property and a value. So it always goes property, value, semicolon. That semicolon there is very important. The semicolon ends the declaration. If you don't end a declaration, it technically just kind of keeps going on forever. It's kind of like a run-on sentence if you didn't put a period. So it's always important after you make a declaration to put a semicolon. After you make a declaration and you finish it with a semicolon, you can start another declaration. There is no limit to how many declarations or how many things you can change about the selector if you want to. All right, so this goes back to sort of the syntax rules, or the rules of how CSS works. CSS syntax goes inside of a special tag. It's a tag we haven't talked about yet, and it's called the style tag. Okay, so here in exercise 1, you'll notice I have this tag called style. What does the style tag do? Well, what it does is this exercise 1, this is actually an HTML page, right? And so this page is following the rules of HTML. What the style tag does is it tells the browser that the following area is not following the rules of HTML, but is instead following the syntax of CSS. So think of it like this. Imagine I gave you like a document, and let's say the document was in English, and then halfway through the document, it just switched to another language, like, Japanese or something like that. That would be very confusing to you because you weren't expecting the document to suddenly switch languages. But imagine I told you ahead of time, like, the following rest of the document will now be in Japanese. At least you'd have some idea of what's going on, and if you spoke Japanese, you would understand that, okay, now instead of following the rules of English, I'm going to follow the rules of Japanese. Excuse me. And that's what's happening here. The style tag basically tells the browser, okay, we're stopping following the rules of HTML, and now we're following the rules of CSS. Okay, so your CSS should always go inside of the style tag, always. The style tag should always go inside of the head section. So remember I kept talking about how, so here's my head section. Remember I kept talking about the head sections for metadata for the browser, things like coding and whatnot. So this counts as code. So this goes inside of the head section always. It should not be in your body section. It doesn't really matter where in the head section is, as long as it's in there somewhere. You should not have HTML tags inside of a CSS document. So in other words, when I get to this part, I should not do something like this. That would not be allowed. Link. Okay. The reason why is CSS doesn't use this kind of syntax, and we're now sort of in this special CSS section. Okay, so no HTML tags should be inside of the CSS section. All properties, these are properties. Properties should always be lowercase. With HTML, things were case insensitive. That's not how it works with CSS. CSS is case insensitive, and it should be lowercase. And then another general rule, and like I said, don't worry, these rules will, the more we practice it, the more, it'll make sense. But there are no spaces in property names. So sometimes you'll have property names that are multiple words, like font size, or font family, or, I'm trying to think of some other ones. There's one called grid template columns or something like that. Instead of having spaces, because you're not allowed to have spaces in property names, instead they use hyphens. So you see there's a hyphen there. So anytime we have something that has multiple words, instead of spaces, you'll use a hyphen. Okay? So let's take a look at this. I got my page here. This is exercise 1. And this is what my page looks like. All right. What I want to do is I want to change the color of my heading 1. Right now it's defaults to the default of the browser. Typically that's going to be black. I want to change it. I want to make it another color like red or something. So to do that, because that's a visual change, I want to use CSS. I'm going to go inside of here. This is my style tag. Notice that my style tag is inside of my head tag. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. This is my selector. What this means is it's going to go through my web page and select all of the H1s. Whatever I put here, that's the thing that's going to be changing. Okay. CSS is similar to HTML where white space is not is irrelevant. It's not counted. So for instance, that or that is exactly the same. So a lot of times you'll see people write their CSS like this, so that each property and value gets its own line. That's just a common way you'll see it. You don't have to do it that way, but that's how you see a lot of people write their code. So selector, brackets, property, colon, and then value. Now in this case, color means text color. So what this is saying is I want to change the text color of my selector, my H1s, or in other words, I want to select all H1s and change their color. I'm going to say red. Okay. I'm going to hit save. And let's go back to my browser. And I'm going to refresh. And it turns red. Okay. So what's happening is the CSS is overriding the basic user agent, as we've talked about here. And I'm setting my own custom color, which I've set to be red. Okay. Here I have an H2. I want to change its color. So right now it's just using the default of the browser, which is black usually. Let's make it green. So this is my selector. So that means, I'm going to go through my page and select all H2s. Selector, brackets, property, colon, value. The value is, once again, whatever color I want it to be. Let's make it green. All right, I'm going to hit save. And it turns green. Okay. I'm going to go, and let's do another one. I'm going to say, let's do H3. Color, and let's do yellow. Okay. I'm going to save, and I'm going to refresh, and you'll notice that nothing turns yellow. Okay. Now the reason why this particular code didn't seem to apply is CSS can only apply to HTML that already exists. So in other words, like, as I kind of talked about before, it's like you need to have the HTML first so you can style it. If you actually look at the code of this page, there is no H3. So if there's no H3, there's no way to apply the CSS on top of it. CSS does not create HTML. So if there is no H3, it's not going to just make it for you. Okay, and so since there is no H3, nothing's going to get styled to be yellow. Okay. Now, eventually, if I do add an H3, like this, if I come in here and just do something like this, this is an H3, then it actually would do it because now there is HTML to stylize. All right, so, use this as a good base. So it's like, okay, let's say I want to stylize the color of my paragraphs. These are my paragraphs. How would I stylize the paragraphs? Well, if we look at it, the paragraphs are inside of a p tag, right? So just kind of, you remember how I said, like, once you kind of, remember how I said once you sort of learn opening tag, closing tag, you kind of learned like 70% of HTML, right? Well, when it comes to CSS, once you learn selector, brackets, property, colon, value, semicolon, that's about 70% of CSS. Okay. Then you just kind of need to learn all the different properties and values it can take, and that's, that's how it's going to work. And we'll do more practice of it. So let's do, I want to select all the paragraphs. This can be the p tag, and let's set it to pink. Okay. Let's refresh. There you go. All right, so try that out. Open up the exercise and try selecting different things. Try selecting the list items and stylize them, with a color. Try selecting the hyperlinks and stylize them with a color. Use the same process. The thing that you want to select, brackets, property, and then color. If you want to play around with some fun colors, I'll put a link in the HTML for you, but there are certain color names that web browsers recognize. So here's a list of them. For now, I wouldn't worry too much about it. I just would use basic color names, But if you really want to get in, like, I don't know, let's do slate blue. That one looks fun, right? So I'm going to go back. Let's do slate blue. And actually, the whole color system should be built into Visual Studio Code. So if you start typing it, it'll probably do it for you. There you go. There's slate blue. All right. So try that out. Exercise 1. And in the next couple videos, we'll talk about different CSS properties we can do to format text.